One of the great fantasies of any age is for us to have the ability to fly. Oftentimes when we're imagining this, we don't imagine ourselves with inconvenient things like wings. It's more magic propulsion through the air, a la Superman. In D&D worlds, the unbridled joy of flight is theoretically accessible to all, if they can cast the 3rd level fly spell or get someone else to cast it on them. Some of the sapient species of D&D worlds also have the ability to fly naturally. All of this is to say that humanoid flight, personal flight, is a real practical concern in any D&D styled world, and we should consider it as such with practical and tactical considerations. So it's a fairly common consensus among D&D players that flight is essentially the most powerful ability that you can get as a species. The argument is that flight trivializes or even negates certain obstacles, traps, and even entire combat encounters. Fighting by a cliff, pressure plates, and packs of wolves all become significantly less dangerous if you can fly. To this, I would broadly agree. One thing that I don't think gets discussed enough, though, is the resignation that I often see from game masters when they encounter flying party members. Fundamentally, if you can't find a way to challenge your players, something's either gone wrong a lot earlier, or you're holding on to a misconception or a crutch far too hard. Sure, a pack of wolves isn't likely to be able to actually threaten Birdman, but they could instead try to eat his friends, his allies, a local village, or his pet chicken. Because if you've got an entire species of bird people in your world, then that is a world of magic and monsters. Basically, definitionally. So perhaps we've got wolves corrupted by chaos that can magically teleport into the air. Or perhaps you just choose to threaten your players with creatures that have arms and or opposable thumbs. One of the most frustrating things to me is when someone suggests that a creature like a blue slot, a CR7, is in-game, in reality, unable to hit a flying player. It's an encounter that can be purely bypassed through simple flight because the blue slot doesn't have access to any non-melee attacks on its stat block. And that is true. But it's only true if you only ever use the published stat block to exclusion. Slard with a gun is not some sort of banned combination because there's been no stat block published where a Slard had any sort of ranged weapon. It's not unofficial homebrew, except for maybe the gun part. It's a reasonable response to creating challenge for one's players, using environmental factors and tactical pressures that might actually exist in your world. What I'm saying is that if we're trying to present a world that operates upon its own internal logic, which I imagine most of us are trying to do, the very existence of people who can fly, either magically or not, and even monsters that can fly, is going to change some material fact about how battle and combat is waged in your world. Any entity that is capable of thought is going to try and have some sort of contingency plan just in case. We're going to start with winged flight, because for the most part, winged flight is basically strictly better than magical flight, and so is a more dangerous threat in combat. First, on a practical level, although not technically in a mechanical sense at all in the world of D&D, wings make you a larger target. The wings themselves, by the way, are a fairly large target on their own, and a key vulnerability for any creature that is currently using them to be in the air. In hand-to-hand combat, with a shield and weapon, oftentimes the easiest target to hit is a leg. Because fundamentally, a leg is about the furthest point away from the core of one's offense and defense. They're often one of the least risky, safest, and most likely targets to hit. Plus, if you damage your enemy's leg, they're not exactly going to be able to get away from you, or be very effective maneuverability-wise in the rest of the fight. Wings amplify all of these problems greatly. Firstly, most flying creatures that use wings to fly have wingspans that are generally larger than their arm spans, especially if we're going for any sort of anatomical realism, meaning that any shield one possesses can't really effectively be used for wing defense while airborne. And secondly, unlike legs, you can't really armor a wing. Wings need to transfer as much force into keeping someone in the air as possible, generate as much lift as possible, which is negatively affected by armour, especially if these wings have feathers and flight feathers that essentially require airflow through them. Padding them in a whole bunch of cloth or leather is just not going to be a sensible way to get yourself off the ground at all. To put it lightly, wings are usually large and easily breakable targets, which are nearly impossible to protect, and if we're going with a not so dense bone structure to kind of keep the weight of the creature down, they're also going to be very, very fragile. A sling, for example, can easily break bones. Hitting the main body of a wing, the wing section of a wing, let's call it, is going to probably punch a hole straight through, which is generally not going to be great for one's ability to continue flying. And hitting the actual structural supports, the musculature or skeletal structures that keep the wing able to move, that's going to be a real problem. That might just disable a creature from flight altogether. Add to that the fact that nets, bolos and lassos all exist and work very well against targets that are running, and the complexities of flight mechanics added onto all of that might make these very, very difficult for a flying creature to escape from if they get caught. I mean, imagine the devastation of being grappled or restrained and having your movement speed reduced to 0, when having your movement speed reduced to 0 when you're relying on wings for natural flight causes you to immediately drop out of the sky by the Xanathar's rules at a rate of 500 feet per round. If you're 200 feet up or more, that's on average about 70 points of bludgeoning damage the moment you hit the ground, which is enough, by the way, to instantly kill a griffin. The best strategy an airborne natural flyer can employ is to be comfortably out of the range of any of your enemy's weapons high up in the sky, and to drop things onto your enemy's heads, essentially. Hoping against hope that there's no sort of magic that is going to tether you to the ground or ground you or bind up your wings or anything like that the enemy has access to. And also hoping that your enemies aren't smart enough to go and find some cover, an outcropping, let's say, or simply hold a shield above their head to avoid all the falling debris, which, by the way, if you're directly above your enemy and looking down at them and dropping things on top of them, then a shield is essentially all you're going to actually need to cover your entire body from that specific upwards angle, with a reasonably sized person and a reasonably sized shield. It is fundamentally a lot harder to take cover in the open sky than it is on the ground where all the stuff is. Now, I will admit, a lot of this is not technically enshrined in 5th edition's rules, except for the cover bit, which I see no reason why installing yourself and completely blocking any view of your body from above by having a shield above you wouldn't give you total cover. That just makes sense to me mechanically. But yeah, wings don't make you a larger person. Targeted shots don't really exist, which, could be seen as a weakness of 5th edition and could be seen to boost the power of natural flight. Technically, we'll get to why that still isn't true a little bit later. But regardless, I said that natural flight was the good one. As it happens, there are a couple of small advantages of non-natural flight over natural flight, such as not having massive wings to encumber you and have to tailor your clothes around and all that nonsense. And it would be a little easier to carry a bunch of stuff if your flight speed was set magically and not done through physical exertion. However, non-natural flight presents some massive new issues that we have to deal with. First off, your flight is only going to last for about 10 minutes with the fly spell. It's enough for a combat, or for traversing a small distance. But for each problem you encounter during the day, that's a new casting of a 3rd level spell. Second, it is a 3rd level spell, and to cast it on any more than one person, you need to up that by 1 level per person you're casting it on, which gets expensive fast for the price of those spell slots and what you can do with them otherwise. And third, and most crucially, Fly is a concentration spell in 5th edition. This is the big one. Like we discussed with winged combatants, one of the biggest issues of flying is having your ability to fly suddenly revoked and plummeting to the ground, taking a lot of damage, falling prone, which happens if you take any damage at all from a fall, and then people rushing up and hitting you with their axes anyway. It is even easier to knock someone out of the sky who is using the fly spell than it is to knock someone out of the sky who's using their own 2 wings. This is assuming that the spellcaster has cast fly upon themselves. If a spellcaster has cast fly on a different creature, go after the spellcaster on the ground. They're no safer than they were before, and they've wasted one of their spells. The trouble is, even assuming that our mage has a constitution score of 18, which is pretty bloody high for a secondary stat, it's not until level 17 that your saving throw proficiency in constitution saving throws, which you'd probably have to take a feat to get, is going to guarantee that you auto-succeed on any constitution saving throw against a single point of damage. And the more you try and outrange ranged weapons with height, the more risky it becomes to fail that save if you do miraculously get hit. Because then you're taking the average 70 points of bludgeoning damage that happens when you fall out of the sky onto the ground. Unless you cast Featherfall on yourself, which essentially makes you target practice for any being that has any sense of timing or rhythm, or can predict that person falling at certain velocity will continue falling at certain velocity because they've used magic. Seeing as, unlike with winged flight, there's no clear vulnerability or weak spot, the best strategy for taking down a magically flying person is to hit them with a whole bunch of pot shots. Hit them as many times as you can with ranged weapons from as many different entities you can muster to try and force a concentration break. There are a couple more advantages to the fly spell that wings don't have that we do need to mention, though, in these specific, very niche circumstances. Firstly, fly can be cast and used effectively in corridors, even quite tight ones, where wings and having a good wingspan and actually being able to maneuver is going to be impossible. And as of the 2024 rules, you can now officially drop prone while flying without falling out of the sky, because the fly spell in 2024 gives you a hover ability. I choose to interpret dropping prone while flying as entering the Superman position, because that's how it's perceived and that's the natural language, and natural language kind of tends to win in rules interpretation here. Which would, if you're flying down a corridor towards someone, assuming the Superman pose with a shield out in front of you, would have the exact same effect in reverse as standing underneath something directly above you and having your shield up. It reduces the actual damageable area of you to 0, therefore I would say giving you effectively total cover. However, technically, while you're prone, you're not able to use any flying movement whatsoever, because the only way you can move while prone is specifically by crawling. Alternatively, you can use half your movement to right yourself. So theoretically, even while flying, you can drop prone, protect yourself a little bit, and then get up and right yourself. This does, however, mean, again, technically, that flight in D&D is not Superman-style flying. It's more like Magneto, hovering through the air while standing bolt upright the entire time, because that's how the prone condition operates with hover. Magical flight must be quite an awkward, clumsy affair. The requirement to right yourself means that essentially everyone who is flying using magic is going around T-posing and just gliding forward through the air. Majestically, perhaps? This means that approaches to three-dimensional combat that would work in water, like what we've been talking about with limiting the angle of approach by swimming directly towards a target with a shield out in front of you to reduce the visible area that you can be targeted in against a single entity at least, doesn't work with magical flight in Dungeons and Dragons. Because again, to use any movement from your magical flight, you must first right yourself. Which, again, check the Prone rules. It's right there. It also has the added downside of making your magical flight users a little less cool and a lot more obvious in their approach if they can't duck and weave through scything through trees and have to instead glide forward, chest forward like a proud Baron Harkonnen. So with that analysis of winged and non-winged flight out of the way, let's talk tactics. Because regardless of the criticisms I've just levied, flight is a powerful tool. You gain a greater field of vision. On a battlefield, that's very useful. You simply have more directions that you can move in. You can avoid most terrain-based obstacles, including moats, barricades, swamps, and anything of the sort. And you can rain down bombs from above, with the downside of being a very clear and obvious target up in the sky to anyone who has the range to tangle with you. Which, I will again stress, any reasonably intelligent creature with the right setup of limbs should have some sort of ranged weapon, be that a spear, if they're a big, tough, strong guy, or a crossbow, if they've got, fingers and delicate enough dexterity. It's ludicrous to imagine that the rampaging, complex and dangerous monsters of this world would walk into a situation, if they have any ability to not do so, where they can be completely humiliated by a single guy zipping around with wings. With the long range of most simple ranged weapons topping out at about 60 feet, you'll definitely want to be above that as a flying combatant. That's the minimum if you want to actually pelt things below you with ranged attacks while not getting hit so often yourself. Although, if your enemy has longbows, you want to be at least 150 feet in the air to at least get into their long range, meaning they have disadvantage on attacking you, generally. Probably the most effective way to use a flying force of troops is in a carpet bombing type strategy. Harassing enemy backlines and drawing them out from entrenched positions, making sure they stay high enough to be out of harm's way from any of the technologies or weaponry or magic that the enemy may have access to. This does mean that high winds or low visibility might scupper the success of any flying troops you use anyway. From a realism perspective, you'd probably also struggle to armour a flying core of creatures who need to generate enough lift and can't carry too much, but you'd at least struggle to supply them, even in D&D. They can't stay up there forever with a bunch of fairly heavy ordnance. And that ties into the fundamental operational limit of a flying creature. Yes, if you give an Aarakocra a bag of holding with a collection of bombs filling it, they can be up there for a long time and cause a lot of havoc in the meantime. But generally, if you're not supplying them with super important space and weight compressing magical items, there's a limit to how much you can carry up and throw down on someone before you need to go and resupply. Equally, there's a quite narrow time limit on the capacity for a creature that is using magical flight as well. The 10 minutes is just about probably going to be enough to get into position and looping up above the enemy position, drop a few bombs for maybe a minute, and then come back to safety. Otherwise, you're putting yourself at great risk of danger by overstaying your welcome. But what if you use the fly spell on, say, an archer with heavy armour, some sort of fighter who's the greatest shot in your retinue, creating an unparalleled fighter turret to pepper enemies with arrows from on high, unreachable except by the enemy's archers, which will bounce off against his majestic armour. Surely casting the spell on someone else negates most of the downsides of needing to be good at firing and good at magic, and needing to wear decent armour to protect yourself, to have good dexterity, good ranged attack skills, and the danger of losing concentration on the spell if your spellcaster stays all the way in the back. It's a decent strategy, especially against brutish, melee-focused entities that are easily provoked and didn't think to bring a ranged weapon. But if you've got time to prep, or you know what your enemy's going to be, you're better to try Gulda's Tower or Magic Circle. If you want to kite a group of melee enemies, slow is generally more effective. And if you really want a flying force multiplier that actually adds something to your action economy, instead of neutrally upgrading something slightly to be more unhittable, try Summon Fae, whose bonus action is a no resource cost teleporting, essentially a disengage, that also cloaks the fairy in a cloud of darkness, making it much harder to hit anyway, even if the creature has a ranged weapon that can hit something within 30 feet of it. And that's after they get a swipe with their sword. It adds an extra entity, an extra body, and an extra pool of hit points into the initiative, as opposed to kind of just making one guy slightly better. All of those I just mentioned are 3rd level spells, the same as Fly. The simple fact of the matter is that Fly is not an effective spell in mass combat, nor is it particularly good in small adventurer-style combats, unless you can guarantee that every other combatant is so far out of harm's way that the entity is going to be forced to focus on this unkillable flying turret. Otherwise, the only purpose achieved by sending one of your members up into sky where they can't be harmed is reducing the number of viable targets on your side that can be targeted by the opponents. So in our Pack of Wolves example, all you've done is effectively reduce the number of different targets the wolves can attack by 1, making them, weirdly, more optimal in their attacks because they're more likely to be focusing fire. Now, Fly is a significant tool for high-level dungeon delving, at the point where it can be cast on all party members to bypass all essentially non-magical traps. But at that point, you've probably got other resources that require a 6th or 7th level spell slot and your concentration for 10 minutes. And sure, although a naturally winged warrior gains no downside to having these massive wings on them that are unlikely to be able to be armoured at all, which seems like a mechanical oversight, really, the risk for a winged creature, though, of being knocked prone, or for example, having their speed reduced to 0 by another method, such as the casting of web on their position, is a real significant threat, and enough to make that method of flight not terribly appealing either. As well as the potential for any of your victims, if you're doing this kind of, drop arrows on them sort of thing, any of your smarter victims should just find themselves an outcropping somewhere underground or just go inside. It makes flying in general not that effective as a strategy. And by the way, because some of you are going to talk about this, web does work within 60 feet on kind of restraining a creature using winged flight. The web spell ends at the start of your next turn when cast not supported by any trees or other objects. So at the start of the enemy's next turn, which is definitely going to be in between the turn you cast it and the next of your turns, the enemy is going to be somewhere in there. At the start of their turn, they have to make a save against the web if they're in its area, and they will be in its area, because even though the web collapses in on itself, it will collapse in on the central point, which is going to be them. Therefore, they're going to be caught in the web anyway, have to make the save, and if they fail, they'll plummet 500 feet to the ground if they're using winged flight. For me, I think the final nail in the coffin of the flight supremacy comes not in the fact that you can't really do it indoors, but in the fact that to definitely be outside of the things you're trying to avoid, melee attacks and nets, you need to be about 15 feet away from the head height of your enemy. This means that in most types of terrain, you've got nothing. no cover, no ability to protect yourself other than by your own skill. There are very few terrain types, even in fantasy worlds, where you will find a great deal of cover in the sky. Additionally, being 15 feet away from your enemy's head may put you out of party auras, may put you out of the range of counterspells, or put you outside of the range of silvery barbs as well, if another entity is trying to duel you in the sky. Essentially, it isolates you from your team. It makes you a separate working unit, which can be good, assuming the monsters don't have weapons to hit you, which they generally should, if they're smart, and if they're dumb, assuming that your party on the floor is going to survive the encounter, while the enemies may get natural cover from any trees or canopies or rocks that might be in the way between your and their position if you're in the air and they're on the ground. So there it is. A diatribe on why I think that flight is genuinely quite overrated in the Dungeons & Dragons playing community and optimizing community. But I'm curious, do let me know your thoughts, do let me know if we've got anything wrong on those rules. Again, 2024 rules I'm more shaky on than the normal ones, but I don't believe I've got any details of that particularly wrong. And if I do, please do let me know, as I said. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the TTRPGs. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.